Hello and welcome to the CX Files for the 21st of July 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan, based in Montreal, Quebec. Can't believe, Mark, we're almost towards the end of July. I mean, where has this year gone?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. It's just been incredible. You know, I had a daughter born just in March. And since then, which feels like yesterday, her weight has more than doubled, compared to her birth weight. So it's just incredible.
Well, it's amazing to think that your daughter has doubled in weight, and quite frankly, it seems like just yesterday you were texting me with the photos when she was born. It's wild to think that we're nearly 6 months down the road from that, and you've obviously fallen in very nicely to fatherhood and are enjoying it. And I know that at this point, Mark, you are planning a little bit of travel to see family in the UK and introduce your little one to friends and family.
Yeah, this month, July, we're actually going to be in Bath, Cheddar, Weymouth, Farnborough, London. So kind of all over the south of the UK, visiting my parents, friends and family as well.
Well, that's great. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to make it to Portsmouth or not, but if not, this trip might be another one.
It could be good for some BPO research, yeah.
Absolutely. But Mark, what are we talking about today? What's on the agenda for the pod?
Well, we've got a great interview. It's with Tony Wan, and Tony Wan is kind of like a rock star in the gaming player support world. Everybody, I think, knows Fortnite, which has been one of the biggest games of the past few years. And Fortnite's made by Epic Games. Tony was the head of player support for Epic. Prior to that, he was the head of player support at Riot Games. Right now, he's actually taking a bit of a sabbatical. He's taking some time off, spending time with his family in South Korea. But he's doing a lot of consulting and advisory work around how games companies can improve player support. And I saw Tony commenting on LinkedIn recently. He was kind of like curating this argument around player support for games is completely different to normal customer service. And, there was a lot of comments on this on LinkedIn. People were saying, no, keep the customer happy. It's all the same. But there were some points on the other side as well. And I think that, maybe one of the key points was around things like, well, a gamer playing your game is actually giving their free time when there's other things they could be doing, but they love being inside that game and playing it. So if they've got a problem, you need to help them, but you also need to appreciate that you're sort of advising them on something they love, which is completely different from, if you've got a problem with your retailer and, something hasn't arrived and you're calling up customer service to find out where it is.
You're spot on. And you're really talking, I think, about something that has been highlighted a couple of times on the podcast with previous guests. You might recall a few months ago, I had the chance to talk with Mike Pipicello from Global Step, who has a true interest in the gaming sector. And he was very much reiterating what I think that we're going to be hearing later on in the pod, that this is a very, very distinct set of consumers. It's a very distinct vertical to support, and it's not business as usual. There's no cookie cutter approach you can apply to gaming from other sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got another gaming company lined up, Testronic, that I'm planning to talk to. Depends on, my travels this month. But again, the point is that there seems to be quite a few gaming companies like Mike's company that are really specialized in handling players. They hire gamers to do the agent work, so the people that are actually on the back end of these inquiries from the players are people who really understand the games, so I think that that's a really important difference, because instead of just talking about training people, very briefly in the product and then focusing their training on the customer service approach, you're talking about the domain knowledge being critical. I mean, either you know how to play that game or not. So that's a major difference here.
And it's funny because I remember there was a Netflix show that was out a couple of years ago about the history of gaming, and they were talking a little bit about how customer support for Nintendo kicked off in the late 1980s, early 90s with a very, very rudimentary call center. But effectively, the agents had to know that book about the game backwards and forwards. And we're not talking about the little instruction manual that used to come with the cartridges that we would unpack and religiously study. We're talking about literally dossiers. We're talking about binders of information. And if you couldn't support a player having memorized and having really understood what those dossiers contained, it just wasn't going anywhere. Think about it today with the complexity of games. Think about the complexity, not just about the games themselves, but also the extent to which you're playing against other people around the world, the fact that the games can change in real time, that the games are learning constantly using AI platforms about how to improve. There is a huge amount of complication and complexity that goes into supporting individuals who are gamers as such. And being able to recognize, number one, this fact, and number two, execute on delivering the best possible service, that's crucial.
And I think that there's lessons to be learned here across BPO more generally. This idea that you need to have really strong domain knowledge rather than just a quick 2-hour course in the products you're supporting. I think that applies in other areas. There's things like fashion, for example, where if a fashion oriented customer contacts their favorite brand and then finds that the people on the customer service team know absolutely nothing about the products, then how is that going to enhance the experience? And I think it's the same with stuff like consumer electronics. If you've got a problem with your new phone, your new laptop, your new smart TV, when you contact that brand, you expect that person to understand the product inside out. And so
yeah.
That's definitely what we can see in the gaming environment. And I think that's an approach that can be transferred to other areas.
Well, let's go right to the interview and find out a little bit more about this fascinating and ever-evolving topic.
Okay, Tony, it's great to get you on the podcast. I saw you posting on LinkedIn recently, and you were talking about player support and customer service and saying that they're entirely different. And, I saw in the comments that some people were arguing that at the end of the day, we're just trying to make the customer happy. So what's wrong with that statement?
I actually think I would correct it a little bit and said, I wouldn't say they were entirely different. I think I know the post you're talking about. And in the comments, I said that there's some fundamentals that are certainly shared, and then there are others that are certainly not. And, fundamentals for me, I think the last time I looked at the definition is just things of central importance. And, I think, for example, if you're running a restaurant business, it's got many broad fundamentals, but there's specifics to running a sushi restaurant versus a fast food burger joint that do matter. So, you see this in the existence of verticals and BPOs. I don't think it's controversial. I don't think that information is controversial. But what's wrong with, I would say, the kind of blanket statements where people want to think, are we just trying to keep everyone happy? Is that the context doesn't allow for that. The environment of a live service game that has a very strong free-to-play business model means that there are bad actors in the environment. And that means you can, with very good intentions, end up assisting criminals in essentially robbing people's homes or destroying their lives or destroying their credit or whatever else. Their identities, their real world identities, so we do have to be on guard for those things. It's good to be nice, for sure, don't get me wrong, but in this kind of environment where there's plenty of bad actors, you do have to caveat that. You have to be nuanced about what that means.
Okay. And is that made more difficult then? Because often you're managing customers, they're not really customers. They're using your product, but they're not paying to use your product. So do you need to sort of create some sort of twin track strategy of preferential service for those that are paying, and then a kind of regular track for everybody else who's on the free service?
Sure. I think if the company is successful enough, which I've had the fortune of working at a few places that have been very successful, there's no difference in how you would ideally treat paying players and non-paying players, simply because non-paying players do have value in the ecosystem. I always used to like to tell people like, hey, you can't really do a battle royale without 99 other players, in the mix. And it's hard to have fun in a competitive esports type game without competition, real life competition to practice with and to get you there. So, I think it's important to think about the context that you're in. If you're successful enough, I think there shouldn't be really a difference in the way you treat players based on spend necessarily. I think there are other categories in which you should differentiate to give, let's say, a more tailored experience. But I think basing that on cost is not something I would do for partially for the reasons that I just mentioned. But if I was a small, which I've had before, a small startup, um, I've in the past had to get creative with my resources and create some kind of prioritization system. But I would base it not only on spend. I think spend would be an important factor if I just didn't have enough resources, but it would be combined with other criteria such as issue severity, you know, engagement issues, playtime, and balanced. Like if I had an ad monetization model, for example, for non-paying free-to-play people, that would be in consideration as well. It's like, well, these people are still making us money by viewing ads, etc. So I'm gonna prioritize maybe a combination of how engaged is this person, combined with their spend, combined with other, let's say, a value that they provide in the ecosystem. I think it would be a mistake, even in that case, just to have one metric to say, oh, we're going to serve these, and then we're not going to serve these, et cetera. So I think you can make it a little bit more detailed, and that would provide a stronger understanding of your player base and how they relate to your business, but then also how you're distributing your resources and what that is kind of truly affecting, for the business. So yeah.
Yeah. So actually, it's much more likely that you might give preferential treatment to a high spending player rather than discriminating the free play ones.
Right, more like a higher place in the queue, for example, or even if they were like a non-spending, but they were like a guild leader that was just very highly engaged. I encourage people to try to come up with value equations that make sure that they're valuing everything in their ecosystem appropriately, again, versus just kind of one metric.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, talking about value then, a lot of games now do have in-game currencies, in-game objects that have their own kind of value within the game. Often you need them to progress. And, do you find that creates a problem when people are calling and complaining and saying, my object vanished, or, is it hard sometimes? Does it feel like sometimes people are fishing for compensation?
Sure. I think anyone who's worked live service games has definitely felt run into, let's say, the fishing crowd who are looking for free stuff. I think in general, some people expect it, but for many different reasons, some of them very legitimate, I would say, and some not. Some are fishing, and some have circumstances where a digital item or digital currency compensation makes absolute sense, like 100%, just due to the details of the case, which is kind of goes back. This hits again that point of going back to like why we can't just try to make everyone happy, because there are definitely people who are going to try to exploit that, right? And might create unintentionally some bad patterns of player behavior, and more often than not, everyone has a horror story of trying to be nice, and then they accidentally increase their ticket volume by orders of magnitude by giving away free stuff. It's no mystery that if you're going to give away free samples of something, let's say, for example, at a Costco in the US, that people who are interested are probably going to swarm. I'm guilty of that. If there's a Vitamix person in the place, and I have one at home already, but if they're making free stuff, I'm going to line up and get myself, one of those tasty juices just because it's there. even though I can make it myself at home. So you got to be careful with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so I suppose then, on that point, then, I mean, would it be better sometimes not to keep the player happy? Maybe sometimes it's just better to ban the player because, you can't satisfy them, or they're making a really unreasonable request.
Sure. I would say you should be very, very careful with the ban hammer and bans. Just a comment before we dive into this a little deeper. Bans don't really work as like a kind of a permanent or a long-term solution. As disappointing as that may be for a lot of folks, it tends to be a rather blunt instrument. We do use it, but for certain kinds of things. And I would say, clear cases in which you do want to ban people is, I think most obviously, if they're just being interaction-wise, if they're just being a terrible human being. We don't condone the abuse or bullying of others or of our staff just because someone's a player or a customer. And I think any, reasonable human being supports that idea. It's like, you would be just nasty to people just because you're a customer, right? That's not okay. Besides the interactions themselves, though, and there's plenty of ways that poor disruptive behavior in games is unacceptable, whether that's trolling behavior or like cheating or some other antisocial behaviors towards other people in the ecosystem. Those are unfortunately fairly common in a lot of games, especially competitive games. And then so there's a whole kind of nest of stuff there, and there's another nest of stuff too. So you have the interactions, you have the interactions within the game itself, and then you have those very touchy kind of fraud or other kinds of crime, identity theft, etc., where you don't want to make the criminals happy. And in that space, we've got to consider how we're going to add reasonable and valuable friction around those interactions that are attack vectors for the bad actors to protect our legitimate customers, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of interactions that we ask our player support agents to deal with on a regular basis, and those are not all the same. Some of them require for them to be very much kind of on guard and much more of an investigator, and other times it is regular customer service, and hey, yeah, how can I help you? And sure, I'll get that for you, and no problem, I'll solve that for you. But there are different personas in which we ask our teammates to be able to discern and put on as they're helping players in very complex interactions sometimes.
Yeah, so there's definitely more complexity in player support. We're not just following the old kind of customer service mantra of the customer is always right. Then,
right. I mean, that's because in a lot of cases, if you're running a restaurant where they've already paid you, or retail or something like that, that's very different. That they've purchased an item from you, etc., and you can see them face to face. It's not like someone else just randomly coming off the street saying, yeah, give me some food for free. It can be quite different, yeah, and challenging to navigate.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, just to wrap up then, I mean, this seems quite different to regular kind of customer service that we might see in a retailer or a bank or insurance company. But we can see all of the customer service giants, the BPOs, they're all piling into gaming. It's clearly a big opportunity for them, and they have experience of customer service. But do you think that the kind of generic customer service organizations really have this kind of detail on how gaming is different?
I think there's a spectrum of understanding so far in the BPO space, as far as I can see, ranging from some who have very solid experience through the years and had a focus on this. But I would say for the majority of the traditional players, it's still a very light understanding. I think I think you have a lot of head nods these days that like, okay, this is different. We need to, for example, make the decision to make a gaming vertical in the BPO. I see a lot of that these days, but that also needs to be followed up by material investments from the BPO to, let's say, let that vertical operate differently. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. Has been a challenge for a lot of my friends and colleagues in the industry, is to really understand, well, okay, we've made kind of the verbal, commitment, and okay, we've hired a few key people, but it really then needs to, well, what does that mean for how we operate this part of our business? I think those meaningful long-term operational changes at a large scale have yet to come from most BPOs out there, unfortunately, at this point. And I think it's only really been visible in a very, very small, like single-digit numbers of, maybe it's a provider that's focused on games from the start that can actually point to, oh, we have a couple people from, who have history at other large BPOs. They come here, but we specifically built out a different operational model to account for, X, Y, and Z in the games industry, right? And that is much more uncommon to see, those specific changes. Many times it's just a cosmetic, like, oh, we put some images of gamers on the website or whatever, and it's like, that's okay. It's a good start, but we need to go further and make it a bit more meaningful. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Tony, that was great to catch up. Thanks very much.
You too. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.